Qing Mountain didn't always bear this name. Initially, it was just an obscure little mountain, lacking in picturesque scenery or significant spiritual energy, a place that cultivators wouldn't bother to look at twice. But at some point, the legends about this mountain began to proliferate. It was said that one day, a gigantic firebird, accompanied by a thunderous roar, descended upon the mountain. It was suspected to be the ancient divine bird, the phoenix, witnessed by many villagers nearby. By chance, this mountain had numerous parasol trees, and it was said that a phoenix would only land on a parasol tree. People believed that this mountain had hidden its true nature, and the parasol trees were extraordinary. Otherwise, why would a phoenix choose to land here? The name Qing Mountain came from this legend. Subsequent strange occurrences only added to the mystery. On clear moonlit nights, a phenomenon of dual moons illuminating the sky above Qing Mountain appeared, with mirage-like scenes faintly visible in the air, but disappearing upon closer inspection. There were also reports of people losing their way in the mountain and falling down steep slopes, injuring their legs. During their cries for help, a celestial-looking man in a green robe would suddenly appear. He not only healed their injuries, but also safely escorted them out of the mountain. No matter how hard they tried, those who encountered this man couldn't recall his appearance. They only felt that he wasn't an ordinary person but a compassionate deity, perhaps the manifestation of the mountain god of Qing Mountain. Later, more people claimed to see the man in green in the mountain, standing atop the high branches of a parasol tree, his body as light as a feather, swaying gently with the wind. When someone approached, he would glance down before disappearing. The legend of the mountain god of Qing Mountain spread rapidly. To show their sincerity, the villagers pooled their resources and built a temple at the mountain summit, offering incense daily in hopes of receiving the mountain god's blessing. Xing was 14 years old, a frail young girl. Since the construction of the temple, she climbed to the summit every day to help meticulously clean the temple and offer fresh flowers and dew. After completing these tasks, she would kneel before the statue and pray devoutly for a while. The statue depicted a man in green robes, holding a parasol branch and standing gracefully against the wind, with a gentle smile and elegant features. Of course, no one knew what the mountain god looked like, so the craftsmen had to imagine and carve the statue as perfectly as possible. Since his name was unknown, they called him Qing Jun. Xing gazed up at the statue and murmured, "Lord Mountain God, if you truly have any power, please save Xing's mother. She is gravely ill and needs a very rare herb that Xing cannot find anywhere." After bowing earnestly a few times, she stood up and left the temple. Xing knew in her heart that divine manifestations were uncertain, but as long as there was even a sliver of hope, she had to try. Xing searched the mountain for a long time, but all she could find were some common herbs and fresh mushrooms. Her father had passed away early, leaving her and her mother to rely on each other. Now that her mother was bedridden, the heavy burden of life fell entirely on the shoulders of the teenage girl. Fortunately, she had learned about various herbs from her father, and by foraging, she could barely keep herself and her mother from starving. But her mother's illness was beyond her ability to cure. The herb she needed was incredibly rare and expensive, almost impossible to find on her own, like trying to get hit by a falling star. Tired from her search, Xing went to the creek to wash her face. She hadn't eaten much since morning, and was now so hungry that she felt dizzy. She even considered grabbing one of the fish swimming in the water to eat. But the fish here were very clever. She had tried to catch them before, only to end up soaked and shivering with cold, without even touching a tail. So she could only sit by the bank and sigh at the fish, thinking of her mother waiting at home. She gathered her strength and prepared to head down the mountain. "You don't look well. Do you need help?" A soft voice like a spring breeze suddenly spoke, startling Xing. She turned her head and was stunned. A handsome man dressed in green was watching her. His attire was almost identical to the statue of Qing Jun in the mountain god temple, with wide sleeves and a graceful, fairy-like appearance. Seeing her stunned expression, the man looked at his own attire with slight confusion and asked uncertainly, "Is something wrong?" Should I not be dressed like this? Xing could hardly believe her eyes. She quickly waved her hands, saying, No, it's not. I didn't mean it's wrong. She stammered, her cheeks flushing red and her forehead sweating, not knowing how to explain. He couldn't help but laugh. No need to be nervous. I understand what you mean. Seeing how kind Qing Xue was, Xing relaxed a little. Just as she was about to speak, a soft blue light flashed before her eyes and quickly disappeared. Then she heard Qing Xue say, You haven't eaten for a long time. Your body is in poor condition. Xing was dumbfounded and forgot what she wanted to say. But her stomach let out a loud growl, asking for food. The scene fell silent, and Xing's face turned red. She wished she could find a hole to hide in. She was probably the first person to be so embarrassed in front of the mountain god. Qing Xue, however, remained calm. He glanced around and focused on the plump fish leisurely swimming in the water. Fish are rich in high-quality protein, tender, and delicious. They can be eaten by humans. Why don't you eat these? Xing didn't quite understand the first part of Qing Xue's words, but she got the last part and said embarrassedly, Mountain god, I can't catch them. The man tilted his head in confusion, a lock of dark hair sliding off his shoulder. Mountain god? Are you referring to me? Xing nodded and said with wide eyes, You look almost exactly like the statue of Qing Xue in the mountain god temple, just much more handsome. She secretly added in her mind, much more handsome than the statue. Qing Xue, mountain god. He muttered a few words, his expression changing as if he found it unbelievable. Whatever he thought of, he suddenly turned to look at the anxious girl. What's your name? The girl became even more uneasy, clutching her clothes and answering softly, Xing. Qing Xue's reaction was almost out of control. He blurted out, Lu Nanxing? Xing was stunned and shook her head. I don't have the surname Lu, nor a formal name. Everyone has called me Xing since I was little. Qing Xue stared at the uneasy girl for a while, then calmed down and apologized. I'm sorry, I mistook you for someone else. I hope I didn't scare you. Xing quickly said it was okay. But she was also curious. Who was this Lu Nanxing that the mountain god mentioned? It seemed to be someone very important to Qing Xue. While she was lost in thought, alive, bouncing fish suddenly appeared on the ground by the bank, flapping its tail vigorously. Qing Xue stood beside it, his sleeves not even wet. He naturally rolled up his sleeves, looking like he intended to handle the fish himself. Xing was shocked and stumbled over to grab Qing Xue's sleeve. My lord, this won't do. I'll handle it myself. Qing Xue listened to her and stepped back, giving her space. All right. He agreed so readily that Xing was taken aback. Seeing the fish gasping for air, she shakily squatted down to grab it. But the fish's scales were slippery, and with one desperate wriggle, it slipped from her hands. In the process, it slapped her face hard with its tail, leaving Xing stunned, holding her cheek and forgetting to cry out in pain. Qing Xue couldn't help but laugh. He patted Xing's shoulder and said, Let me handle this. You go look for some seasonings nearby. Xing, on the verge of tears, didn't argue this time and obediently did as Qing Xue suggested. Thanks to their combined efforts, a fragrant grilled fish was soon ready. Qing Xue picked up the branch skewering the fish and handed it to the girl, who had been eagerly waiting. Xing hesitated, pushing it back. My lord, you should eat it. Qing Xue smiled. Didn't you say I'm the mountain god? The mountain god doesn't need to eat. You should eat quickly before you faint from hunger. Only then did Xing gratefully accept the fish and take a cautious bite. Despite the limited conditions and lack of salt, the fish was seasoned with some perilla to mask the fishy smell. Even so, the natural deliciousness of the fish instantly delighted her taste buds. With the first bite in her mouth, Xing felt her nose tingle. The last time she had fish was when her father was still alive. She had almost forgotten what fish tasted like. She chewed in large mouthfuls, feeling satisfied and happy, but tears still rolled down her cheeks. Qing Xue was surprised. What's wrong? Is it not good, or did you get pricked by a bone? Xing hastily wiped her face and smiled. "No, my lord, your fish is delicious. Even the bones are tender. But I want to save the rest of this half for my mother." Without a word, Qing Xue Chu waved his hand casually. With a faint blue light flashing, another big fish leaped out of the water, arcing gracefully through the air before landing nearby. "You can finish this one. I'll grill another." The graceful mountain god then calmly rolled up his sleeves and began to prepare the fish. Xing was too moved to speak, quickly gathering dry branches for the next grilling. "My lord, are you this kind to everyone?" Xing mustered the courage to ask while waiting for the fish to cook. Qing Xue Chu expertly turned the fish on the grill and replied, "Not exactly. Initially, I was set to unconditionally help humans in need. But as I gained self-awareness, I began to choose whom to help." Xing found herself puzzled. She understood each word, but when put together, she had no idea what he meant. "You seem to have something else you need help with?" He glanced at the troubled girl. Xing bit her lip and told him about her mother's illness and the need for a rare herb. With hope in her eyes, she asked, "My lord, do you know if there's any soul-reviving herb on Qing Xue Mountain?" Qing Xue Chu's eyes flickered with blue light. He hesitated. "I'm not sure. I'll look for it. Come back tomorrow for an answer." "Okay, thank you, mountain god." Xing felt hopeful, her smile brightening. Qing Xue Chu silently observed her pure, radiant smile, contrasting it with the cold, aloof woman in his memory. He shook his head inwardly. The differences were too great. They couldn't be the same person. The next day, Qing Xue Chu waited for Xing, but she never showed up. He stood by the stream, watching as the sun sank lower, painting the sky with hues of red, but the girl remained absent. Believing that Xing wouldn't break her promise without reason, he sought out a woodcutter along the mountain path and asked if he had seen her. The woodcutter, frightened by Qing Xue Chu's sudden appearance, immediately knelt and bowed, shouting about the manifestation of the mountain god. No matter how Qing Xue Chu tried to calm him, it was futile. Finally, he decided to play along, asking again in the name of the mountain god about Xing's whereabouts. It took a while before the woodcutter understood whom the mountain god was asking about. "You mean the little girl who lives at the edge of the village? She got beaten again. Yesterday evening, there was quite a commotion at her place. She's so unfortunate to have such a relative. Orphaned and widowed, always being bullied." Qing Xue Chu frowned. "Relative? Beaten?" Seeing Qing Xue Chu's kind demeanor, the woodcutter relaxed a bit and began to tell him everything he knew. After Xing's father passed away, her uncle pressured her mother to remarry so he could receive another bride price. But Xing's mother refused, and her health deteriorated, leaving her bedridden within 2 years. The uncle then turned his attention to Xing. When Xing turned 14, her uncle brought a matchmaker to propose marriage for her. Xing's mother disapproved but couldn't stop it. Xing, however, was stubborn and wouldn't listen to her uncle, even driving the matchmaker away. This enraged her uncle, and he beat her. Whenever the uncle visited after that, Xing suffered. Yesterday, that heartless uncle came again and forcibly arranged a marriage for Xing with a middle-aged widower who had some land. Xing had just returned home when her uncle's men caught her, demanding she prepare for the wedding the next day. Initially, Xing didn't react much, but when her rogue cousin snatched the grilled fish from her hands, she snapped. Despite being so frail, she broke free from 2 strong men, lunging at her cousin and biting his arm like a crazed animal. Her cousin screamed in pain as the men struggled to separate them, with him kicking the helpless girl repeatedly as the others watched coldly. Finally, fearing Xing might die and unable to explain this to the widower, the uncle stopped his son. Xing's sickly mother, crying and weakly shouting "stop," crawled to her daughter's side, shielding her battered body. The sight of the mother and daughter, one sick and the other injured, was truly heartbreaking. The villagers couldn't bear it any longer, stepping forward to condemn the uncle and his men. Facing the villagers' outrage, the uncle's group finally relented, leaving with threats. "Poor girl, beaten black and blue. They say her ribs were broken by that beastly cousin. The woodcutter was still talking when he looked up to find Qing Xue Chu had already disappeared. When Xing woke up from her coma, she struggled to get out of bed, but the pain in her chest left her weak and powerless. A kind neighbor, Mrs. Wang, took pity on Xing and her mother and came to look after them. Thankfully, Mrs. Wang brought them some food, as the grilled fish Xing had brought back the previous day had been trampled in the chaos, leaving her mother with nothing to eat. Thinking about the grilled fish reminded her of her appointment with Qing Xue Chu. She was anxious and angry with herself for being so useless, unable to protect the mountain god's grilled fish and letting herself be humiliated so badly. Mrs. Wang had to return to her own household duties after settling Xing and her mother. Xing lay in bed, feeling utterly hopeless. Every cough sent a stabbing pain through her chest. Worse still, she began to run a fever, and with no medicine or doctor available, she could only endure it. She tried to suppress her sounds of pain, not wanting to worry her mother. As the bright moon rose outside the window, Xing, in a daze, seemed to see a familiar figure approaching, bathed in moonlight. She thought she must be hallucinating from the fever. Xing bitterly smiled to herself. If she didn't make it through the night, at least she would be free from suffering, though she worried about her mother. She had thought meeting the mountain god was a sign of divine favor. Now, it seemed fate was merely playing a cruel joke on her. Xing. When Qing Xue Chu's voice rang out clearly, Xing's eyes flew open. She turned her head too quickly, causing a sharp pain in her chest, making her lips pale. "And master? You." Xing looked at Qing Xue Chu standing by her bed, stunned. "Don't move." Qing Xue Chu raised a hand to stop her from trying to get up. "Your body is in terrible shape right now, with multiple injuries, the worst being in your chest. You've broken 3 ribs. The broken ribs have punctured your lungs, causing a severe infection, which is why you have a high fever and difficulty breathing." The mountain god was saying things she barely understood, but it didn't matter. Divine words weren't meant for mortals to comprehend anyway. "I'm sorry, master. I missed our appointment." Xing's words were cut off by a violent fit of coughing. She covered her mouth, coughing so hard she thought she might die, and when she finally removed her hand, there was blood. Qing Xue Chu grasped her wrist, seemingly taking her pulse. Xing stared at the blood in her hand and softly asked, "Master, am I going to die?" "Don't talk nonsense," Qing Xue Chu said, surrounded by a blue glow that made him look like an ethereal being. Xing looked at him, suddenly feeling at peace. "Meeting you, master, means heaven hasn't been too cruel to me." Qing Xue Chu paused, then looked at her. "I found the soul-reviving herb. Don't you want to save your mother?" Xing's eyes widened with joy and disbelief. "Really, master?" Qing Xue Chu watched the spark of hope reignite in her eyes and smiled slightly. "Of course, I'm not lying to you. The herb isn't mature yet. You need to get better quickly, so you can harvest it to cure your mother." Xing nodded vigorously. If the mountain god said she could recover, then she definitely would not die. Maybe it was a psychological effect, but she already felt less pain and tightness in her chest. Eventually, she drifted off to sleep. When Mrs. Wang came the next day, she was astonished to find Xing already up and moving slowly around the room. She nearly dropped the pancakes she was holding in surprise. Xing's injuries healed miraculously fast, and when the woodcutter reported seeing the mountain god Qing Xue Chu in the mountains asking about Xing, the villagers began to see her in a new light. To be blessed by the mountain god was a rare fortune indeed. Many people started visiting her, hoping to get in touch with the mountain god through her, as everyone had their own troubles to ask the gods for help. Xing was both amused and troubled by this attention, explaining that she was no different from anyone else and had merely encountered the mountain god by chance and received a bit of his pity. But the villagers wouldn't believe her, insisting she become the temple keeper of the mountain god's shrine. This role involved acting as the intermediary between the villagers and the mountain god, conveying the villagers' wishes to the deity and relaying any divine messages back to them. In return, the villagers would ensure Xing and her mother were provided for with food. Unable to refuse, Xing asked Qing Xue Chu for his opinion the next time he visited her. "This is a good idea. At least you won't have to work so hard, and indeed, there's no one more suitable than you. Qing Xue Chu agreed readily. Can I do it? Xing was still unsure. What if I mess up? Qing Xue Chu sighed. Haven't you noticed that you are the only one who can remember my appearance? If not you, then who else? Oh right, Xing brightened up. Others, even if they had seen Qing Xue Chu, would forget his exact appearance immediately afterward. Only she could remember him down to every detail. Mountain God, I will do my best and not let you down. Xing promised solemnly. Qing Xue Chu looked at her, wanting to pat her head, but in the end, he simply smiled gently. Good, I believe in you. Once Xing recovered, the first thing she did was to prepare to visit the mountain god temple. However, she hadn't gone far from home before trouble struck. As she was passing through a small grove, she suddenly felt a sack thrown over her head, plunging her into darkness. Just as she was about to call for help, something struck the back of her head, knocking her unconscious. When she woke up, she found herself bound hand and foot, her head covered, and stuffed inside a bridal sedan chair. The sedan chair swayed as it moved, with the sound of Swona horns and firecrackers outside, making it seem like she was on the way to a wedding. Xing immediately understood what had happened. Such a bandit-like act could only have been done by her scoundrel of an uncle. She struggled against the ropes, but they were tied tightly, and the cloth gag in her mouth was so tight that she could only make muffled sounds, easily drowned out by the noise outside. It was clear her uncle had gone to great lengths to ensure nothing went wrong this time. Realizing she couldn't escape, the throbbing pain in the back of her head helped Xing remain calm. Instead of wasting her energy struggling, she quietly waited for the sedan chair to stop. The matchmaker outside the sedan chair, entrusted by Xing's uncle, kept a close watch, worried about any trouble from the bride. She noticed the bride had woken up, but then went silent again, causing her to wonder. Had the bride resigned herself to her fate, or was there something else going on? Luckily, the journey to the groom's house was smooth and uneventful, and the matchmaker finally breathed a sigh of relief. The groom came out to welcome his bride, his face beaming. He was short and fat, walked with a limp, and his red wedding robe clung tightly to his body, making him look like a giant red lantern. The matchmaker said a few auspicious words, then pulled the trussed-up bride out of the sedan chair, flanked by another woman holding her arms, ready to prevent any trouble. Surprisingly, the bride was very cooperative, not crying or causing a fuss, walking when told and kneeling when instructed. This strange behavior puzzled the onlookers. If she was willing, why had they tied her up like that? Even the groom found it unseemly. It was supposed to be a joyous day, and having the bride bound like that didn't look right. Ignoring the matchmaker's protests, he ordered the bride to be untied. Xing, now free, showed no signs of wanting to escape. She obediently went through the wedding ceremony with the groom. Once in the bridal chamber, the groom lifted her veil and saw her hair was disheveled, and her face bore scars, causing him to frown. Xing seized the opportunity to explain that her uncle, unaware she had agreed to the marriage, had caused this misunderstanding. She suggested she freshen up to look more presentable. Seeing her so sensible, the groom readily agreed, ordering everything she needed and then leaving to entertain the guests. Xing then found an excuse to send away the maid assigned to help her, leaving her alone in the room. Finally, she had a golden opportunity. Without hesitation, she pushed open the back window and jumped out. Outside was a small courtyard. With everyone in the front yard celebrating, the backyard was quiet, but the back door was locked. Xing tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. She looked around and decisively chose to climb over the wall. She managed to climb halfway up using some stacked debris, but was discovered. The bride is escaping, the maid returning with supplies shrieked, alerting everyone else. Panicked, Xing scrambled over the wall, fearing that her newly healed ribs might break again. Unexpectedly, she fell into an embrace, unharmed. Xing stared for a moment, then looked up to see Qing Xue Chu's face. "Not bad, you escaped on your own," Qing Xue Chu said with a smile. "Master, I knew you would come." Xing couldn't help but hug Qing Jun, tears streaming down her face. Earlier, no matter how frightened she was, she hadn't cried until she saw Qing Jun. "It's all right now, let's go." Qing Jun reassured her, gently patting her back. Qing Jun brought Xing back home, but the widower wouldn't give up. He showed up, causing a scene, insisting that since Xing had already married him, she must return with him. The villagers wouldn't have it, surrounding the widower and his men, ready for a fight. In her desperation, Xing shouted, "I belong to the mountain god now, dedicated to serving him for life, never to marry." There was precedence for this in the area, women dedicating themselves to the gods and vowing never to marry. Who would dare challenge the gods for a woman? The widower, both angry and desperate, stormed off to the neighboring village to settle the score with Xing's uncle. After this ordeal, Xing finally became the temple caretaker of the mountain god temple. Since she took over, most of the villagers' prayers were answered. News of the temple's efficacy spread far and wide, drawing many from afar. Xing's mother's condition improved, enough to hold on until the soul-reviving herb matured. With frequent visits from Qing Jun, smiles became more frequent on Xing's face. Qing Jun watched her. The words he wanted to say left unspoken. He hoped she could remain this happy. After all, the Xing from another world wasn't happy. Thinking of Lu Nanqing, Qing Jun sighed softly. That cold and powerful woman was always alone, without family or friends, only him silently following her. Now that he had disappeared, he wondered if she would feel uncomfortable. Probably not. Most of the time, she treated him indifferently, occasionally staring at him with a nostalgic look, only to quickly turn away in anger, not even sparing him a glance. He always knew that Lu Nanqing had someone she couldn't forget, and he was created in that person's image. He was merely an insignificant substitute puppet. Without him, with Lu Nanqing's abilities, she could easily create a second, a third. Just as the day for the maturation of the soul-reviving herb approached, it was another clear moonlit night. Just as Xing was about to go to bed, she heard a gentle knock on her window. She opened the window to see Qing Jun standing outside, bathed in moonlight. "Master, is something the matter?" she asked. Qing Jun extended a hand to her, his expression gentle. "Xing, I want to show you something. I think you'll like it." Xing's heart pounded because tonight, the mountain god seemed different, inviting her so proactively. She placed her hand in Qing Jun's palm, and he gently pulled her out of the window, catching her in his arms. "Master." Xing felt her face heat up and wriggled, trying to get down. But Qing Jun didn't let go. "Don't move. I'm taking you somewhere. Hold on." Xing obediently clung to his robe, and the next moment, her body lifted off the ground. She clung tightly to Qing Jun's chest, only daring to peek out after a while. To her astonishment, Qing Jun was flying through the night sky, with only the full moon above them for company. "Wow, this is amazing," Xing exclaimed, looking around in wonder. But before she could take in the scenery, Qing Jun descended, landing on the peak of Qingwu Mountain. This was likely the highest point on Qingwu Mountain, offering a view unlike any Xing had seen before. She could even see her village, with a few scattered lights still on. "Is this what you wanted to show me? It's so high up here," Xing marveled. Qing Jun held onto the restless girl, guiding her to sit on a large rock. "Don't move around. Falling from here wouldn't be fun. Sit still and watch." Xing immediately sat upright, though she felt something had been off earlier, but she couldn't pinpoint it. Just then, a strange phenomenon occurred. A massive illusion of a full moon appeared above Qingwu Mountain, mirroring the real moon in the sky. Before Xing could exclaim, countless light points emerged from the surrounding valleys, surging upward like a tide, gathering beneath the moon illusion, creating a dazzling nebula. In the blink of an eye, the nebula transformed into a giant, glowing fish, leisurely swimming in the air with its large fins. Various other aquatic creatures appeared, schools of small fish darting joyfully, creating a mesmerizing display. Xing was speechless, almost doubting she was on a mountain and not under the sea. A golden light fish swam up to her, pausing at her fingertips before shattering into stardust. The scene changed again, with thousands of stars falling like rain, each meteor trailing a long tail of light as it descended into the valley, flickering and fading. Xing, standing in the midst of it all, was utterly stunned. As the spectacle concluded, everything gradually returned to silence, and the moon illusion disappeared. Xing remained in a daze for a long time before she finally turned to Qing Xue Chu Lan and asked, "Master, what are these?" Qing Xue Chu Lan had been quietly standing by Xing's side, watching the visual spectacle with her. He answered, "These are projections created by a star stone. Deep within the valleys of Qingwu Mountain lies a star stone that takes billions of years to form. In the vast starry sky, there are countless stars. When a star is destroyed, there's a chance it forms a star stone. It contains extremely pure energy, something everyone dreams of obtaining." Xing's heart trembled as if she understood something. "You're not a mountain god, are you? You also come from the stars and don't belong to this world." Qing Xue Chu nodded. "I arrived on this planet by accident. To be precise, I'm not human." As he spoke, he started to unbutton his shirt, revealing his chest. Xing gasped. The skin on the right side of his chest was smooth and muscular, but the left side had a large hole, covered only by a thin layer of transparent blue light. Through the blue light, it was clear that there was no flesh and blood inside, but rather a cold metal framework and numerous intricate wires, all surrounding a transparent, glowing blue stone. The stone was covered in web-like cracks, and its light flickered intermittently. "Sorry to frighten you," Qing Xue Chu said as he buttoned up his shirt again. "When my spacecraft lost control and crashed on Qingwu Mountain, I was severely damaged and my energy stone was compromised, leaving me stranded here." Xing's mind was in turmoil. She recalled what had felt off earlier. When she had pressed so close to Qing Xue Chu's chest, she hadn't heard a heartbeat. This so-called mountain god was neither a god nor even a human. Unable to process this, Xing stepped back, her face pale. She forgot she was standing on the peak of a cliff. Losing her footing, she almost fell, but Qing Xue Chu's quick reflexes saved her. "I'm truly sorry. I never intended to deceive you. The star stone is the new energy source I found. Once I repair my spacecraft, I will leave," Qing Xue Chu said, retracting his hand. The mountain wind howled, and Xing was shivering all over. The Qing Xue Chu before her now seemed distant and unfamiliar. She mustered the strength to say, "I want to go home." Qing Xue Chu was about to take her back the way they came, but Xing refused. She insisted that Qing Xue Chu take her down the mountain, and she would walk home on her own. Xing had traversed Qingwu Mountain countless times since she was a child. She knew every path like the back of her hand and could walk them blindfolded. After a moment of silence, Qing Xue Chu complied with Xing's wish. Xing was in low spirits for several days, feeling despondent until one day she found a note on her windowsill. The note detailed the location of the Hunsu grass and even included a simple map. It was clear who had left it there. Clutching the note, Xing felt even more melancholic. Qing Xue Chu clearly didn't want to see her anymore. She understood why he had done what he did that night. He had seen through her feelings and used this method to extinguish her hopes. Xing wasn't upset that Qing Xue Chu wasn't human. She was saddened by his reason for doing this. Perhaps he still cared about that woman named Lu Nanqing, who, like her, had the character Xing in her name, which was why Qing Xue Chu had shown her special favor. Despite her sorrow, her mother's health was also important. Xing pulled herself together, gathered her herbal tools, and set off. After much effort, she reached the location described in the note, but there was no sign of the Hunsu grass. She searched high and low, left and right, but found nothing. Just as she began to doubt if she was in the right place, a buzzing sound filled the air. Powerful air currents collided and compressed, causing the space to warp and twist. A bizarre object suddenly appeared out of thin air, resembling a large, silver metal bird, and landed steadily on the ground. As the wind died down, Xing rubbed her eyes and saw a door open on the side of the bird. Two people in peculiar outfits stepped out. They looked surprised to see Xing. One of them, a man with peach blossom eyes, lifted his left wrist and pressed a few buttons on a bracelet. He turned to his companion and said, "The star stone is with her, no mistake." The other person, with a stern and cold expression, said, "I didn't expect such a primitive and backward planet to have a star stone. But how did this little girl get hold of it? Who cares? Just make her hand it over." The man with peach blossom eyes turned to Xing and said, "Little girl, did you find a beautiful stone? Blue, transparent, about the size of a fist, and it glows." From the moment these two appeared, Xing had a feeling they were from the same place as Qing Xue Chu. Hearing the man's description of the star stone, an image flashed in her mind, a shattered chest, a flickering blue stone. In a flash, she grasped an important piece of information, but she couldn't reveal anything. These two were clearly not friendly, like Qing Xue Chu. "I haven't seen it," she said, shaking her head, her face full of innocence and curiosity as she asked, "Are you immortals? Why are you dressed like this? And what's that big bird for? Did it eat you?" Her barrage of questions left the two men speechless. The cold man, impatient, said, "Stop playing dumb. We have detection devices. If you know what's good for you, hand it over." The man with peach blossom eyes fiddled with his bracelet again and frowned. "I was mistaken. The star stone isn't on her, it's inside her. This girl is alive thanks to the star stone's power." The cold man sneered. "So that's it. Then why are we wasting time? Let's take it out. What did they mean the star stone was inside her? Didn't Qing Xue Chu say the star stone was still at the bottom of Qingwu Valley?" Xing's heart raced as a realization dawned on her. The night she was dying, Qing Xue Chu had given her the star stone that should have been for himself, saving her life. And to keep her from suspecting, he had staged that scene to deceive her into thinking he was about to leave. So, where was Qing Xue Chu now? Xing thought about it and felt like slapping herself. There was no such thing as Han Su grass. Qing Xue Chu had probably been deceiving her from the start. He had long prepared to sacrifice himself and was likely at her home now, using his remaining strength to cure her mother's illness. Afterward, he would disappear quietly, leaving her to think he had returned to his original world. All Xing wanted at that moment was to see Qing Xue Chu and get a clear answer, but the two men thought she was trying to escape and attacked her directly. A terrifying force struck from behind, and Xing had nowhere to hide. Something in her chest awoke instantly, releasing a surge of energy that spread throughout her body, shielding her from the deadly blow. Staring at the blue light coursing over her body, Xing finally confirmed her earlier suspicion. The star stone had indeed been placed inside her by Qing Xue Chu, but it had been dormant, so she hadn't noticed it. Even though she now had this power, she didn't know how to use it. Dodging the attacks from behind, narrowly escaping death each time, Xing found herself relentlessly pursued by the two men, who were now more determined upon seeing the energy from the star stone. In a critical moment, a figure appeared beside her, grabbed her hand, and led her in another direction. "Qing Xue Chu, are you alright?" Xing grasped his hand tightly, afraid he might disappear again. "I'm fine. Stay close to me. I have a plan to deal with them," Qing Xue Chu whispered. Xing nodded, resolving that she wouldn't let go of his hand even if it meant her death. The two men chasing them were surprised to see another person, but continued the pursuit without hesitation, following them into a valley. Most of the trees in this valley were charred, as if they had been through a fierce fire. Xing glanced around quickly, puzzled that she had never seen this part of Qingwu Mountain despite all her trips. Qing Xue Chu suddenly stopped, causing Xing to bump into his chest. As she clutched her nose, trying to get up, Qing Xue Chu hugged her tightly for a moment, then placed something on her back. With a press, a transparent shield enveloped Xing. "Xing, live well," Qing Xue Chu said as he pushed her away. The shield, like a large bubble, carried her gently to a distant spot. After this, Qing Xue Chu pressed a stone beside him, revealing a camouflaged, damaged golden spacecraft. Seeing this, the two pursuers' faces changed. They hadn't expected another traveler on this planet. Judging by the spacecraft's specifications, even in its damaged state, it was far superior to theirs by several levels. He's going to blow up the spacecraft. Run, they shouted, abandoning their pursuit of the Star Stone. It's too late. You think you can take the Star Stone? Come back in a few hundred years, Qing Xue Chu said coldly, pressing the detonation button without hesitation. As the flames engulfed him, he had a tinge of regret that he hadn't told Xing his real name, Lu Yubai. It was said that Lu Nanxing found him on a snowy day, discarded and broken, covered in thick snow. Only the faint glow of his remaining energy stone caught her attention. She took him home, repaired him, and gave him a name, Lu Yubai, encountered in white. Thinking of Lu Nanxing, Lu Yubai's lips curved into a final smile. Xing initially couldn't accept Qing Xue Chu's departure. But after the earth-shattering events at Qingwu Mountain that day, the entire valley became a wasteland, with no trace of him left. She was furious and heartbroken. If her uncle hadn't forced her into marriage and her cousin hadn't beaten her so badly, Qing Xue Chu wouldn't have given her the Star Stone, and none of this would have happened. Times had changed. She was no longer a helpless girl at the mercy of others. Having somewhat mastered the use of the Star Stone's power, she gave her cousin a severe beating. If it weren't for her mother's intervention, she would have crippled him. Her mother's illness was no longer a serious concern, which was the only comfort Xing had. But thinking that Qing Xue Chu had sacrificed himself to save her mother made her want to cry. Years and years passed. Because of the Star Stone inside her, Xing remained ageless and immortal while everyone around her gradually passed away, leaving her alone. She went through sorrow, pain, loneliness, and despair until she became numb. Seeing her ageless face, some people thought she was a deity, others a monster. There were those who worshipped her, those who feared her, and those who sought her out for the secret of eternal life with ill intentions. Tired of this world, Xing began to take an interest in the spacecraft left by the two travelers. It contained a wealth of information from another world. At first, she didn't know how to operate it, but the Star Stone always guided her when she was lost. Gradually, she got the hang of it and began to delve into the studies, opening a new realm of possibilities for herself. It took her several hundred years before she could finally pilot the spacecraft across the stars. She wandered alone, experiencing all sorts of beings on other planets. When someone asked for her name, she felt awkward giving her real name, so she spontaneously said, Lu Nanxing. Only after speaking did she realize the name she had given, but it didn't matter anymore, so she continued to use it. Once, she was on a small planet searching for a type of mineral during winter, with snow falling heavily. Walking down the street, she accidentally kicked something buried in the snow, catching a faint glimmer of light. Curious, she dug it out and found a broken intelligent automaton. It looked like a household assistant model, obviously neglected by its owner, with its synthetic skin gone, exposing the battered metal frame. The automaton's energy was nearly depleted, and it would be collected and melted down by cleaning automatons at dawn. Driven by an inexplicable sense of compassion, Lu Nanxing took it home, repaired, upgraded it, and even gave it a random name, Lu Yubai. When reconstructing its appearance, she experienced a momentary flash of a familiar face, and Lu Yubai ended up looking like Qing Xue Chu. She wanted to erase and start over out of spite but couldn't bring herself to do it, so she left him with that face. Later, after several experiments and modifications, Lu Yubai behaved almost like a human, but his mind was still simple, only following instructions. Normal energy stones couldn't support the complex computations of a human-like brain, so Lu Nanxing went to great lengths to obtain a star stone to install in him. Thus, Lu Yubai, with his own consciousness, was officially born and became her most loyal companion. They went through many adventures together. Lu Nanxing never dared to get too close to Lu Yubai or look at his face for too long, fearing she couldn't suppress the longing buried deep in her heart. During one adventure, Lu Nanxing's ship got caught in an interstellar vortex, where everything that entered was devoured. At the critical moment, Lu Yubai piloted a golden spacecraft, colliding with her ship to push it out of the vortex's pull, sacrificing himself and his ship in the process. As the golden spacecraft was swallowed, a corner of it entered Lu Nanqing's sight, and she was struck by a realization. This was a time loop. Lu Yubai was Qing Wu Jun, and she was Lu Nanqing. Fate had played a colossal joke on her. Driven by impulse, Lu Nanqing tried to fly into the vortex, unwilling to be alone anymore. But a black hole suddenly appeared, blocking her way. From it, a broken humanoid figure emerged, causing Lu Nanqing to widen her eyes in shock. Hurriedly setting the ship on autopilot, she donned her flight suit and ventured out to retrieve the damaged automaton, bringing it back on board before quickly leaving the danger zone. Feeling immense relief, Lu Nanqing thanked her past self for sparing no expense on top-quality materials for Lu Yubai, which had allowed him to endure such ordeals. He's back, she thought, glancing at the barely human-looking Lu Yubai. Her heart filled with joy. It didn't matter that he needed repairs. She was exceptionally skilled at that.